During the special company dinner, a strange man sat at my wife's table and kissed her, as if I didn't exist, as if our marriage were a figment of my imagination. In that second, everything around me seemed to crumble, the sound of silverware, the clinking of glasses, the laughter from the tables next to me, all turned into a distant hum, muffled by the heat in my chest and the trembling in my hands. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss, I didn't break any glasses. I simply stood up, looked her in the eye, and said in the calmest voice I could muster, "From this day forward, we are history." And I left, my body heavy with pain, but carrying the only thing that still belonged to me, my dignity. She came to me the next day. Not to apologize, but to explain. As if cheating required context, as if there were any justification that could erase the image of her accepting that kiss, as if the time we spent together, our nights talking until we fell asleep, the lazy Sundays on the porch, the whispered promises in the dark, as if all of it could be dismissed by a poorly constructed excuse. She told me it meant nothing, that it was an impulse, a mistake, a moment of fragility, that all she wanted was to feel something different. Something different. As if love were an obligation. As if fidelity were a prison. As if I were the jailer of a story she herself helped write. And the worst part? The man, the reason for her mistake, disappeared soon after, when he realized she expected something more. He didn't want commitment. He wanted nothing. He left her only the bitter taste of a mistake, and the dry silence of the consequences. She was left alone, drowning in her own choice. And me? I moved on. But it wasn't easy. Because no one talks about what comes after goodbye. No one prepares us for the moment when anger fades and gives way to emptiness. When memories turn to knives, and the sound of the laughter you loved begins to echo like a ghost through the empty house. I spent nights awake trying to understand where everything went wrong. I turned over every detail, every conversation, every subtle absence, trying to find the exact moment she stopped loving me. If she ever did. And perhaps that's the cruelest part, you never know if the love was real or just convenience. I believed it was love. She said it was love. But in the end, love doesn't betray. Love doesn't kill you inside with a kiss exchanged before your eyes, as if you didn't exist. It took me a while to recover. I had to rebuild myself piece by piece, rediscover who I was without her. Because even though the betrayal was hers, the pain was mine. And the shame, too. People look at you differently when you're the one being betrayed. As if there was something about you that wasn't enough. As if you'd failed in some way. I heard empty advice, forced hugs, phrases like, "You deserve better," or, "She didn't deserve you." But no one could silence what I felt inside, that unbearable emptiness of having lost something that was mine, something I cared for, invested in, trusted. And that's where time comes in. Not as a cure, but as a transformation. Pain doesn't disappear, but it changes form. And amidst the slow and lonely process of accepting the end, life brought me a new chance. Someone who looked at me unhurriedly, who didn't need rehearsed promises, who laughed at my bad jokes and listened to me with genuine attention. Someone who didn't come to fill holes, but to share what was left of me, and help me rebuild the rest. At her side, I relearned the meaning of presence. Of loyalty. Of love without noise, without dispute, without tension. And for the first time, I felt at peace. That's when the past came knocking. Literally. The betrayal had aged her badly. Her eyes no longer held the sparkle of self-confidence. There was weight in her words, hesitation in her gestures, and an awkward longing for something she herself had destroyed. When she met me again, it was with tears in her eyes. Not of pain, but of regret. And there was something else there, something that seemed to say, "You were my home." She tried to smile, apologized with a thin voice. I heard. And I forgave. Not for her. But for myself. Because carrying hatred is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. Much less returning. She asked me if there was still room. If we could try again. But it was too late. I no longer belonged there. The man she'd met had died the night of the dinner. What stood before her now was someone who'd learned to love again, but with someone else. And as sad as that moment was, I emerged from it feeling lighter. Because I realized I was finally free. And she was left with the loneliness of thoughtless choices. The most curious thing happened a short time later. She appeared at my door again, but not to speak. She simply watched from the sidewalk the scene unfolding inside, my new companion smiling, kneeling on the floor, playing with the same dog she'd left behind when she left. I didn't realize it at the time, but later she wrote me a message. A single paragraph. Short, direct, and filled with pain. It was in that moment that I understood everything. You weren't perfect. But you were real. And you were mine. And I traded that, for nothing. That's where the betrayal story begins. Because betrayal doesn't end with the kiss, nor with the end of the relationship. Betrayal is a time bomb. What it destroys often only appears later. When it's too late to rebuild. And it was too late for her. But soon enough for me. What if I told you the ending of this story is even more impactful than the beginning? That the greatest consequence of the betrayal wasn't the breakup, nor the loneliness, nor the regret, but something she never imagined. Something that happened when she finally tried to move on, and discovered she had nowhere else to go. Yes, there was something she saw, something no one could have imagined. And it was at that moment that the true weight of choice fell upon her with full force. Because when we lose a true love, it's not the other person who suffers. It's us who slowly drown in the echo of broken promises. And she drowned. But what was it that she saw that last time? What was it that made her legs tremble, her eyes fill with tears, and her mouth tremble silently, unable to utter a single word? This is the part of the story that no one has told yet. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make something very clear: we do not support any kind of betrayal. Never. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths about choices, consequences, and irreversible losses. Our goal is 1. Show how betrayal can destroy what is most valuable: love, trust, and respect. Get ready. What you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a reality check. Good story. Her name was Laura, and she was the kind of woman who effortlessly commanded attention. Not because of her exuberant beauty, although she was beautiful, but because of the way she walked lightly, as if the world were in no hurry, as if she had made peace with time. She had a silent way of observing everything around her, but when she spoke, it was captivating. Every sentence was measured, every gesture seemed thought out. He, Daniel, was the opposite: intense, direct, the kind who speaks with their body, with their eyes, and who gives their heart without asking for guarantees. They met for the first time at a random party, among mutual friends, where the music was too loud and conversation hardly mattered. But when their eyes met, something there could not be undone. It wasn't love at first sight. It was stranger than that. It was familiarity. A feeling that, even without knowing each other, they already recognized each other. As if they had been something in another life. Or as if they were simply resuming a story interrupted by chance. The beginning was one everyone envies: texts that lasted hours, simple walks that felt like complete trips, comfortable silence in moments when there was nothing to say. Over time, what was passion became routine, but a good, solid routine. Laura was enchanted by the way Daniel looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world, even after years. And Daniel loved the way she made things seem light, how she transformed the everyday into something beautiful just by being there. They built a life together. They rented a small apartment with a balcony, which soon became home. They shared bills, groceries, end-of-month expenses, and long-term dreams. They planted a small garden on the balcony, adopted an old dog from a shelter, and traveled less than they wanted, but more than they could afford. On birthdays, they exchanged handwritten letters, even after a long time together. It was details like these that kept the flame alive. To outsiders, they were the ideal couple. No loud fights, no disappearances, no scandals. They had mutual friends, family lunches on Sundays, a routine of watching TV shows before bed. Nothing seemed out of place. Of course, there were the bad days, the mutual fatigue, the occasional miscommunication. But they never stopped looking at each other with affection. Daniel was the type who made a point of remembering dates, of preparing breakfast on common occasions just to surprise her, of picking up flowers from a small florist tucked away on a side street just because he knew she liked daisies. Laura, on the other hand, was more discreet in her displays. But I knew exactly when he needed silence and when he needed a cuddle. I knew he slept better in his oldest shirt, even if it had holes in it, and that he hated eating sweets after lunch, though he loved dessert in the late afternoon. They were close in what really mattered. Over the years, they built stability. He grew professionally, achieving a leadership position in a company where he was respected and admired. Laura, for her part, found fulfillment in a creative field, working with branding for small businesses, which allowed her a certain flexibility. They had goals and shared plans. They considered buying their own apartment, and they talked about children, not urgently, but with affection. There was no rush, but there was certainty. A relationship that didn't require grand declarations, but was grounded in consistency. They had a habit of dining together, even if only for 20 minutes. It was sacred. They sat at the table, without cell phones, with background music or a candle lit. No matter how long the day or how tired they were, that moment was theirs alone. A simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about how much they prioritized each other. They loved road trips, hitting the road listening to old playlists, and singing off-key as if it were their last trip ever. They saved museum tickets, collected small stones they found in random places, and each one had a story. They even kept a notebook where they pasted clippings of things they wanted to do together, ranging from watching the Northern Lights to taking a pottery class, even though they'd never even looked for a course. Their relationship was full of beautiful intentions, and even if not all of them were realized, the fact that they dreamed together made everything stronger. There was a mutual faith that they would have each other, that they would continue to grow old side by side. They never imagined a life without each other. They never considered going their separate ways. Daniel wasn't naive, but he firmly believed that Laura was a woman who understood the value of choice. And she, however reserved, revealed in small gestures that she felt safe with him. They had an admirable sense of partnership. They shared household chores without pressure, made important decisions together, and knew how to respect each other's space. He enjoyed running early on Sundays, and she enjoyed reading on the porch with a cup of tea. She liked to paint pictures she never showed to anyone, and he, even without understanding art, hung some of them on the living room wall. There was mutual admiration, and also an intimacy that didn't easily dissolve. Their circle of friends also recognized them as a stable, balanced couple. They didn't create drama, knew how to resolve things through conversation, and maintained respect even when faced with difficulties. At parties, they were almost always together, but never clinging to each other. They knew how to give each other space, and this strengthened them. They also had an active social life, with dinners, get-togethers, and celebrations. And it was precisely at one of these events that something, quietly, began to change. Nothing blatant. No fights, no breakdowns. Just barely noticeable details. A distracted glance. A cell phone turned face down more often than usual. Small absences that are only noticed when it's too late. But until that moment, Daniel saw no sign of crisis. Quite the opposite. He felt they were in a good place. They were stable, without turbulence. Sure, the days had become busier, the commitments more frequent, the conversations less profound. But nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a couple with over 7 years of relationship. In fact, he felt mature enough to understand that love sometimes expresses itself more in daily care than in grand gestures. And that was what he offered. A constant, firm, reliable presence. He wasn't the most romantic man in the world, but he was loyal. And deep down, he believed that was enough to sustain everything they had built. Laura, for her part, had been showing more subtle signs of fatigue. She didn't say anything concrete, but there were days when her eyes seemed more distant. As if her mind were elsewhere. Daniel noticed, but didn't insist. He gave her space. He believed she would return. She always did. Maybe it was just a phase, a professional overload, a moment of personal questioning. Everyone goes through it. And she wasn't the type to share her troubles easily. She tended to process everything alone, digest it in silence, and only then speak. It was her way, and he respected it. After all, she always came back. When they received the invitation to the company dinner, Laura hesitated. She said she was tired, that perhaps it would be better if they stayed home. But Daniel insisted. It was an important event, and she knew how much he had worked to make the evening special. It was the celebration of a major professional achievement, and he wanted her by his side. In the end, she gave in. She put on a discreet dress, put on perfume, and smiled in the mirror. Daniel looked at her as if observing a work of art, and she smiled back. They left the house hand in hand, as they had so many times before. In the car, they talked about trivial matters. They laughed. They seemed fine. They seemed whole. But what no one knew was that behind the well-applied mascara and the gentle smile, a storm was brewing. Daniel, that night, suspected nothing. He was proud, happy, excited. It had been a long time since he felt so accomplished. It was a milestone in his career, and he wanted to share it with her. In fact, he was even considering a surprise that night, something symbolic, perhaps a vow renewal. He had written a note that he kept in his inside jacket pocket, a simple but sincere message, expressing how grateful he was to have her by his side at all times. But Laura seemed quieter than usual. He noticed, but didn't question it. He respected the silence. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe. The evening began peacefully. Conversations, toasts, speeches. Laura stood beside him, smiling occasionally, engaging in social interactions with kindness, as she always did. Everything was proceeding as expected. Until it wasn't. Until an unexpected movement, a small, seemingly casual gesture, changed the course of history. And from that moment on, everything solid began, slowly, to crumble. But in that initial moment, before the fall, everything still seemed in place. It was still possible to believe that love was intact. There was still time. There was still hope. Or at least, that's what Daniel thought. And that's what made it all the more cruel. The dinner was, at first glance, perfect. The room was lit with understated elegance, the music was at just the right volume, somewhere between comfort and sophistication, the guests chatted animatedly, and waiters circulated with glasses of sparkling wine and trays of appetizers passed from hand to hand. Daniel felt part of something grand, reaping the rewards of years of effort and dedication. He wore a dark, well-cut suit that Laura had chosen days earlier, saying he looked strong yet sensitive, in the combination. She looked stunning. The blue dress, her hair elegantly tied back, and her makeup light. No one would have guessed she had hesitated so long to attend. As he walked into the room with her, hand in hand, he felt pride, satisfaction, and a strange peace. It was as if all the journeys he had taken to get there had been worth it for that moment. Being with her was confirmation that he had done everything right. Laura, on the other hand, smiled dully. Her eyes wandered from one point of the room to the other with a detached attention. She chatted with her colleagues mechanically, laughed politely, and occasionally responded to Daniel with some distraction. It wasn't coldness, nor was it contempt. It was absence. An absence disguised as presence. As if she were somewhere else, even with her feet firmly on the ground. Daniel noticed, but remained silent. He attributed it all to fatigue, the tension of a busy week, the possibility that she was still digesting some internal anguish. He preferred to believe that. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. And deep down, perhaps he was right. But there was something about that night that didn't match their usual selves. There was a different silence between them, as if an invisible distance had crept in without warning. During the speeches, Laura remained in the background. Daniel took the stage, thanked his team and colleagues, and spoke sincerely and proudly of their teamwork. He thanked his wife for her presence with an emotional look, saying that, without her, nothing would have the same meaning. The guests applauded. Laura smiled. But her smile was strained, discreet, almost forced. While everyone stood to greet Daniel after his speech, she stepped away for a moment, saying she was going to the bathroom. He didn't even notice. He was surrounded by admirers, friends, colleagues, greetings, and congratulations. When he noticed she was no longer by his side, he assumed she was simply taking a break. Perhaps looking for a quieter place to breathe. He never imagined what was about to happen. Laura crossed the room with careful steps. She didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular. But when she stopped near one of the corner tables, something changed in her posture. Her eyes met those of a man who stood up as she approached. He wasn't known. At least not to Daniel. Nor was he part of the company. He was younger, with a confident air and a smile that seemed to know more than he should. The encounter was brief. A dry, direct kiss, leaving no room for doubt. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was done in the shadows. It was an open, disrespectful, cold gesture. And it happened there, in the same room where Daniel was receiving applause and praise, unaware that, just a few feet away, his story was being torn apart before everyone. When he turned to look for her, the eyes of some of the guests had already changed. An unease was spreading. There were whispers. Stifled smiles, averted glances. And then he saw it. He saw Laura with that man. He saw the kiss. He saw the naturalness of the gesture. As if it were every day. As if he didn't exist. As if the years they had spent together were just an insignificant detail in the life of someone who had clearly chosen a different path. His body froze. His hands tingled. Time seemed suspended. For a second, everything went silent. Only the sound of his own heart pounding loudly in his chest. There was no worse scene. There was no more direct pain. There was no scream, no confrontation. Only the raw, painful awareness that everything had changed. Daniel walked to the table with firm steps. He didn't tremble. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just looked at her with terrifying calm. His eyes, until then full of love, were now empty. They said everything without words. And then he spoke. Quietly, directly, as if signing a sentence, "From this day forward, we are history." He turned and walked away, leaving behind not only the hall, his colleagues, the dinner. Leaving behind the woman he had loved for so many years. There was no turning back from that night. There were no explanations. There was no more conversation. He left with his dignity intact, but with his soul torn apart. Laura didn't follow him. She didn't try to explain right away. Maybe she thought silence would be enough. Maybe she waited for him to look for her. But the following days were a desert. Daniel disappeared. He didn't block her, didn't reply, didn't return her messages, but he didn't react either. He continued in silence. He began to empty the apartment little by little. He took only what was necessary. He left the keys at the concierge. He didn't want drama. He didn't want war. He simply disappeared from her life as if he'd never been there. But she knew he had been there. Very much so. Because everything she touched in the house still smelled of him. And now, the emptiness screamed. The following weeks were a blur. Laura tried to move on with her life. The man from dinner had become more present. They began seeing each other frequently, going out together, trying to find something resembling a relationship. But something was wrong. Something off. It was as if every step she took toward this new man reminded her of what she'd left behind. He was attentive, fun, engaging. But there was something missing that she couldn't quite name. Sometimes she closed her eyes and tried to convince herself it was just a matter of adjusting. That this new love might be lighter, more compatible, simpler. But the more time passed, the harder it became to sustain the illusion. Daniel, for his part, didn't allow himself to look back. He threw himself into work. He started running more. He reconnected with old contacts, started visiting new places, and rediscovered forgotten pleasures. But the pain wasn't ignored. He didn't want to erase it. He wanted to process it lucidly. He didn't seek revenge, nor forgiveness. He sought only understanding. Like someone walking over their own broken pieces to understand how the glass ended up on the floor. He no longer cried. But he slept poorly. He would wake up in the middle of the night with his body sweating and his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He tried to understand if he had failed. If he had ignored the signs. If he had been blinded by love. And deep down, he knew the answer wouldn't change what had happened. But still, he needed to understand. Laura's new relationship began to crumble before it even took hold. Small arguments, uncomfortable silences, demands that seemed exaggerated. The promised lightness never came. And, little by little, she began to understand that she had confused desire with the need for change. That it wasn't about passion, but about escape. And when she tried to talk about it with her new man, she received an indifferent look in return. As if it were obvious there was never any depth to it. He didn't want commitment. Never had. And she, for the first time, felt the true weight of the choice she had made. One day, without warning, Laura passed by the old apartment she shared with Daniel. The building was the same, but something was different. There were new plants on the balcony. A wooden chair that hadn't been there before. And for a moment, he considered going upstairs. Ringing the doorbell. Trying to say something. But he couldn't bring himself to. He returned home with a lump in his throat. For the first time, regret wasn't a vague idea. It was physical. Concrete. It hurt his shoulders, his stomach, his eyes. And it was at that moment that he began writing a letter. Not to win her back. Not to justify. But to say that now I understood. That he finally saw what he had lost. What she didn't know was that, as she wrote that letter, something was about to happen. Something that would completely change her perception of everything. Because the past wasn't just in her memories. It was right there, right in front of her. And what would come next wouldn't just be a consequence of the betrayal. It would be a hidden truth, a profound impact that would turn her life upside down. She didn't know it yet. But she was about to discover that losing true love isn't just about losing someone. It's about losing yourself in the memory of what you destroyed with your own hands. It took Laura weeks to find the strength to cross that street again. She parked the car 2 blocks away, took a deep breath, and fixed her hair in the rearview mirror as if that would steady her trembling hands. She carried a yellowed envelope with the letter she'd rewritten 3 times, in which she didn't apologize but explained what had become impossible to keep to herself. The building seemed even quieter than she remembered. The windows were open, and from the balcony, the same beige curtain she'd chosen years before gently swayed. She climbed the steps slowly, hesitating with each step, listening to the sound of her own decisions echoing through the hallways that had once been part of a happy routine. When the door finally opened, she didn't expect to be met by another woman. Daniel's new companion had a serene smile, a light presence. She was simpler than Laura had imagined, and precisely for that reason, harder to ignore. She wore a plain t-shirt, held a coffee mug in both hands, and, even though she didn't know Laura, showed no discomfort. She simply invited her in with a gentle gesture. Laura declined. she didn't have the strength to walk through that door. She asked if Daniel was there, and while she waited for an answer, her eyes, without permission, invaded the room. It was the same, but it wasn't. There were new pillows, different paintings, a huge plant near the window, and in the corner of the room, the old dog she herself had adopted, lying with its nose on its paws, next to a woman who was now part of that space. Laura swallowed hard. The woman stepped away for a moment, and minutes later, Daniel appeared in the hallway, with the same steady gaze as always, but a different weariness. He didn't smile. He didn't seem surprised. He simply said, "Hi," with a neutrality that cut deeper than any shout. She held out the envelope without saying a word. Daniel took it, stared at it for a few seconds, and without opening it, asked her to speak. He didn't want to read it. He wanted to listen. The silence between them was thick, and the new woman's presence there, even out of sight, seemed a constant reminder of what could no longer be recovered. Laura took a deep breath and began, her voice breaking, saying she didn't know where to begin, that everything seemed small compared to the pain he'd felt. She said she didn't expect reconciliation, but that she needed to be honest for the first time in a long time. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the wall, without interrupting. His gaze fixed on her, but distant. She told him that the man she'd been with didn't mean what she thought he would. That there was no love, no future, nothing concrete. It was a mistake driven by personal dissatisfaction, by an emptiness she carried and couldn't name. But that wasn't the main point. What she wanted to say came later. The truth, the one she never had the courage to tell, neither to herself nor to him, is that she didn't cheat on impulse. There was a barely healed wound that went back much further. Laura revealed that, some time ago, during a difficult period in their relationship, when Daniel was facing a huge workload, she felt invisible. For weeks, he would arrive late, exhausted, and mentally absent. And it was during this time that she reconnected with someone from her past. A man she'd been involved with before meeting Daniel. They met by chance at a coffee shop, exchanged contact information, and little by little, he began filling the empty spaces with sweet words, constant messages, and an interest she'd missed. She hadn't crossed any physical boundaries back then, but emotionally, she was no longer loyal. It was a silent affair, one she kept hidden, fueling something she didn't know where it would lead. When Daniel noticed she was acting strangely and tried to get closer, she cut off that old bond. But deep inside, the comparison had taken hold. And since then, the love that was once full began to be questioned, corroded by doubts that she herself cultivated. Daniel, upon hearing that, lowered his eyes. Not because he was surprised, but because he finally understood what he'd always felt but hadn't known how to interpret. That distance that had gradually emerged, that look she'd avoided, that care that had become protocol. He thought it was a phase, that it was stress, that it was time acting up. But it was the emotional distance of someone who had already shared their heart with another. She continued, saying that after the dinner episode, she tried to justify to herself that she deserved a new chance at happiness, that Daniel no longer understood her, that they were on different cycles. But it was all a lie. The raw truth was that she expected him to react, to fight for her, to ask her to stay. But he didn't. And when she realized he wouldn't seek her out anymore, that he wouldn't make a scene, that he wouldn't beg, that's when despair hit her. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to shield himself from the pain that was throbbing again. He said he fought. But he fought in silence. Because he didn't want to beg to be loved. He said he gave everything he had, that he did his best to keep their love alive, and that even in the moments when she seemed distant, he still believed they would meet again halfway. But she chose another path. And now, he couldn't go back. Laura approached, almost touching his arm, but stopped mid-motion. She no longer belonged there. She asked him to say one more thing. Something he needed to know. Not because it would change anything, but because it was true. The night she went to his house and saw, through the window, the new woman playing with the dog in the living room, she understood everything. Because the dog never grew attached to anyone. He was old, stubborn, reserved. And there, seeing him lying peacefully beside someone else, she knew she hadn't just been replaced, she had been forgotten. And that hurt more than anything. Daniel listened in silence. And when she finished, he said he no longer hated. That the hatred was just a phase. But that there was no love either. He said she had been everything. That he had bet everything on her. But now, he understood that love is also knowing how to walk away when you are no longer chosen. Laura tried to smile, but failed. The tears came dry, contained, but evident. She apologized for the last time. And before leaving, she looked around, as if trying to capture for the last time the scene that had once been her home. When she closed the door behind her, she felt the weight of absolute emptiness. For the first time, she understood what she had truly lost. But the story didn't end there. Days later, something happened. Something she could never have predicted. In a desperate attempt to find some meaning, Laura went to visit an old friend. One of the few people she still believed truly knew her. They talked for hours. And, without her asking, her friend mentioned that Daniel had been through something weeks before the dinner. Something no one knew, because he wasn't one to share much. But she, by chance, learned about it. And then came the revelation. The week before the dinner, Daniel had bought a ring. Simple, delicate, but meaningful. He was planning to propose to her as a vow renewal, on a romantic weekend he had secretly booked. He wanted to surprise her. He wanted to show her that even after so many years, he would still choose her every day. The news was a punch in the gut. The ring, the gesture, the care. She betrayed him just as he was preparing to reaffirm their love. While she doubted him, he believed in her. While she was involved with someone else, he was making eternal plans. And it was there, listening to that story while sitting on someone else's couch, that Laura finally broke. Because there was no deceiving herself anymore. She destroyed the only place where she'd ever been truly loved. And now, there was no going back. She got up, left without a word, and walked aimlessly through the streets. Each step heavier than the last, carrying on her back the weight of what she could never fix. Because losing a true love is painful enough. But knowing that he still believed in you at the exact moment you stabbed him, you never get over that. Ever. Laura didn't return home that night. After the revelation that destroyed her insides, she wandered the streets aimlessly, as if every corner were a failed attempt to escape herself. She no longer cried. Her eyes were dry, but her entire body ached. A pain that came not from her flesh, but from her conscience. The ring, the plans, the love that still existed while she was killing him behind his back, it was impossible to digest it. With each step, a different image invaded her mind, Daniel entering a jewelry store, choosing that ring with the same care he used to prepare birthday dinners, him smiling at the attendant as he imagined the surprise he would give her, him hiding the little box in the back of the drawer, waiting for the weekend to deliver it. All this while she nurtured what she believed to be freedom, unaware that she was paving the way for her own demise. There was no repairing it. There was no erasing it. And in that moment, more than regret, she felt shame. A shame that prevented her from looking at anyone, that made her want to disappear. She spent the night in a cheap hotel, lying in a strange bed, her body motionless, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how she had gotten lost like that. When morning came, the world seemed the same, but nothing about her was the same. She sent a short message to Daniel, simply saying that she understood everything and that she was grateful to have loved someone like her once. She didn't expect a response. She didn't deserve one. And there was no response. Contrary to what she expected, he didn't respond with anger or contempt. He responded with silence, the most painful of punishments. Because his silence wasn't empty. It was charged with everything she had destroyed. In the following days, she tried to return to her routine, but she couldn't. The house felt empty, even though it was full of things. Work no longer had meaning, her friends seemed distant, and even the coffee she loved lost its flavor. Not because the world had changed, but because the world she knew crumbled within her. She began to avoid social gatherings, turned down invitations, and cancelled appointments. All she wanted was to retreat, to disappear from the eyes of those who still saw her as that woman who had once been part of something beautiful. Because now she knew she was no longer seen that way. She knew that, little by little, the circles were dividing, that stories were being told from all sides, and that the image she now carried in her eyes was that of someone who had thrown away what many would spend their lives trying to build. That was how she felt, disposable, irrelevant, replaceable. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life with firm steps. He continued working, went out with friends, and laughed more than before. But it wasn't a forced happiness. It was serenity. A tranquility that came not from the absence of pain, but from the certainty of having done everything he could. He didn't feed on pride, but on peace. And this peace was visible. Those around him knew something had changed, but no one questioned it. Because there was respect in the way he chose to move forward. He didn't talk about Laura. He didn't attack. He didn't expose. He just lived. And living, for him, was the greatest response he could give to the past. It was on a Saturday afternoon, weeks later, that the unexpected happened. Laura was in line at a pharmacy, waiting to pay for a sleeping pill, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. It was Daniel's sister. The two stared at each other for a few seconds, both visibly uncomfortable. Laura tried to look away, but was surprised when the other approached, said a curt but sincere hello, and asked if they could talk. They walked to a nearby coffee shop. They sat across from each other, like two people who once shared a bond but are now mere acquaintances divided by history. Daniel's sister was direct. She said she was there because she felt she needed to clarify some things. Not for Laura, but for herself. She said it had taken her a while to forgive her internally, that at first she felt anger, contempt, and a desire to erase her from the family's memory. But over time, she began to understand that people don't lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves gradually. And that, although she never justified what Laura did, she could see that she, too, was hurt in the process. And then, with a sincerity Laura hadn't expected, she talked about Daniel. She said he was fine, but that he had changed. That now, he seemed whole, but in a different place. She said he had reconnected with a woman he'd known in his youth, someone who made him smile with her eyes. That they seemed light together. And that, unlike Laura, that woman wasn't trying to be perfect. She was just present. Laura listened to everything in silence. She swallowed the words like someone swallowing stones. The pain wasn't just jealousy. It was awareness. Because now she saw, clearly, what she'd always had before her. And the cruelest thing, what she'd lost. Daniel's sister, before leaving, said something that would forever be etched in her memory. He forgave you. But life, Laura, life takes its toll when we least expect it. And sometimes, the greatest punishment isn't losing the other person. It's continuing to exist in the same world as them, but no longer by their side. Laura didn't answer. She just nodded, as if accepting the sentence. He returned home with the words hammering like an echo. He slept badly. He woke up worse. And the next day, she decided she needed to see him one more time. Not to ask for anything. Not to try to win him back. But to tell him, looking into his eyes, that she now understood. She sent a simple message, asking for 5 minutes. He responded the same day, arranging to meet at a park where they usually walked on Sundays. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting on the wooden bench by the lake. He had the same posture as always, but with a gleam in his eyes she didn't recognize. A gleam that said, "I'm fine." She approached slowly and sat down beside him. They gazed at the lake in silence for a while, until she began to speak. She said she didn't expect to be forgiven. That she didn't expect him to forget. But she needed him to know that she had lost herself, yes, and that she was aware of it now. That her mistake wasn't just cheating, but doubting their love. That she spent years trying to find outside what had always been inside. And that, in the end, all she found was loneliness. Daniel listened attentively. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he simply said he understood. That today he looked at everything with a healthy distance. That he no longer felt anger or pain. But he also no longer felt love. He said he wished she could find herself again, that she could find peace, but that he could no longer be a part of that process. And, before getting up to leave, he left one last sentence: we don't lose love by not being perfect. We lose it by not being there when the other person needs us. And I waited, Laura. I waited until the last second. She remained seated, watching him walk away along the same path that had once brought them together. This time, without hope, without hurt, without the desire to chase after him. Only with the certainty that it was all over. And with the full knowledge that true love is not measured by the good days, but by the hard ones. And it was on those days that she chose to be elsewhere. Time would move on. Life too. But something inside her would never be the same. Because what she destroyed wasn't just a relationship. It was the only love where she was, truly, chosen. And when that's lost, there's no time to heal. Laura remained seated on the park bench for long minutes after Daniel had left. The leaves fell in slow movements around her, some touching her feet, as if even nature had understood that there was a silent mourning there. Not a mourning of death, but of consciousness. His absence was no longer physical, it was symbolic, absolute. It was an absence that could no longer be filled with promises, tears, or the best version of herself. It was the end of the road, and she knew it. She knew it with a sorrow that tightened her chest, not as despair, but as a bitter recognition of what it means to lose something through one's own fault. There was nothing left to say, and any gesture would be futile. The time she waited to realize the value of that love was the exact time life needed to tear it from her hands. And now, she had to deal with it, live with the noise of everything that had once been a promise, and was now just a memory. In the days that followed, Laura didn't speak to Daniel again. She didn't look for him, didn't text him, didn't make any more attempts. She learned, albeit belatedly, that persisting would be just another way to hurt what had already been hurt so much. She began to put away the objects that still connected her to him in a box. Small mementos scattered around the house, a mug with a handmade design, a book with an inscription, a photograph of the two of them laughing about something she no longer remembered. He put everything away, one by one, silently, with steady hands and a trembling heart. He didn't cry. The pain was different now. More mature, more silent. It was the pain of lucidity. The pain of someone who finally understands that love isn't guaranteed, and that no one stays forever just because they promised one day. There's an invisible line between love and the end, and those who betray never see that line until they cross it. Meanwhile, Daniel was rebuilding his life with conscious steps. He had let go of the desire for revenge, the need for answers or emotional justice. He realized that there are pains that only time can explain, and that it was no longer his job to fix what was broken by another. He began to share his days with a woman who didn't want to prove anything, who didn't make him compete with expectations, nor harbored the need to compare herself to the past. It was a lighter, calmer love. There was no euphoria, but there was truth. She listened more than she spoke, laughed spontaneously, and knew how to respect silences without suspicion. Daniel wasn't looking for a replacement for Laura, and that's why it worked. Because he wasn't trying to repeat what he had, but to live something new. Love now wasn't a repair, it was a new beginning. Laura, for her part, began to be haunted by a restlessness she couldn't name. The world seemed the same, but she felt like she had become a stranger to her own life. She tried to move on, enrolled in courses, went to therapy, read books on self-discovery, but there was a part of her that no longer fit in anywhere. It was as if the guilt had become a second skin. The friends she still kept in touch with avoided bringing up the subject, and even those who still welcomed her no longer looked at her the way they used to. She knew. She knew she had crossed an invisible line, and that some relationships, even without a direct breakup, would never be the same again. The hardest part, however, wasn't the judgment of others, but the mirror. The moment of the day when she faced her own reflection and saw herself as someone who once had everything in hand and chose the opposite. It was hard to forgive herself. And maybe, deep down, she didn't even want to yet. The dilemma that began to grow within her was greater than regret. It was the question that woke her in the early hours of the morning, that throbbed in the silence of her shower, that echoed during her work breaks. Who am I now? Because the woman she had been by Daniel's side was someone she believed in. She was someone she respected. The woman who had lost herself, who had betrayed, who had lied, was a version she barely recognized, but could no longer deny. And now, all she did was try to figure out how to live with that part of herself without letting it define her forever. She didn't want to erase the past, but she also didn't know how to build a future from it. It was a difficult place to be. And she was alone there. One rainy late afternoon, she received an unexpected call from Daniel's mother. The voice on the other end was calm, but filled with time. She said she needed to see Laura, not to talk about what she'd been through, but because she felt there were things that could only be said face to face. They arranged to meet at the same cafe where she and his sister had spoken weeks before. The place was empty. The sound of rain hitting the window filled the silence with a certain melancholy. When they sat down, the woman across from her held her cup in both hands and said, with a serenity that only years bring, that she had chosen to meet her not for Daniel, but for herself. She wanted to understand. She wanted to listen. Laura, for the first time, spoke about everything without a shield. She shared the details she'd never told anyone, the feelings that didn't always make sense, the doubts that consumed her before the mistake, and the weight she carried afterward. Daniel's mother didn't interrupt her. She just listened. And when Laura finished, her eyes watery but without tears, she heard something she never expected. The pain you feel now is the greatest proof that you are not what you did. But it doesn't change what happened. My son loved you with everything. And even though he's moved on, he'll never be the same. And that, Laura, is your legacy. It's up to you to decide what you'll do with it. That sentence was a turning point. Because Laura understood that living with a mistake wasn't just about accepting external judgment, but bearing the consequences in the eyes of those who saw everything fall apart. And in that moment, more than any other, she knew that Daniel's forgiveness was real, but that love, that had already died. Not with anger, but with maturity. And sometimes, that hurt more. Because there was something infinitely more cutting about being forgiven by someone who chose to move on without you than being hated by someone who still loves you. She returned home feeling the need to do something with it all. Not to change the past, but to transform the present. She decided to write about what she'd experienced, but not as a way to vent. She began drafting a text that became a project, a kind of chronicle telling a story without names, without dates, but full of truths. It spoke about how small distances become abysses, about how emotional distractions can mask shortcomings that, often, are not the other person's fault, but our own. And most importantly, it spoke about the importance of choosing someone every day. The text was published on a literary blog, unsigned, but it went viral. It received hundreds of comments, messages from people who found themselves in that dilemma, who thanked her for feeling understood. And for the first time, Laura felt there was something beyond the pain. A purpose. A way to make what was left count for something. But even with this anonymous recognition, there was something that still haunted her. The possibility of one day looking at Daniel from afar, with another family, with another life, and realizing that she was just a bad chapter in a good story. This possibility, though painful, was also the greatest proof that he had prevailed. And she learned. And in that space between what is lost and what is learned is where the true moral dilemma lies. Because not every mistake destroys. But some teach us with scars that we will carry forever. And Laura now carried hers with dignity. She no longer tried to hide or change. She simply learned to live with the emptiness she left, and with what was left of herself. Because in the end, perhaps this is the hardest part of life, looking at who we were, accepting what we did, and still having the courage to keep going. The following days were filled with silence and restraint. Laura no longer spoke to anyone as much and learned to be present only to herself. She carried with her the exhaustion of someone seeking not redemption, but some kind of understanding that never came. She harbored an immense desire not to be remembered solely for her mistake, but also the nagging awareness that sometimes, a single mistake is enough to erase everything that came before. She began to avoid places where she might encounter Daniel, even knowing that in the few places she frequented, he would likely no longer be there. His new life already inhabited other routines, other corners, other circles. It was a life that no longer included her name in any recent memory. And this absolute separation from the present was what hurt her most, the realization that her story with him was now just a page turned in a book that continued to be written by other hands. He began working remotely more frequently, avoiding the cafes where he'd previously drawn inspiration. At home, the walls seemed heavier than before, as if the absence of voices and footsteps echoed his poor choices. One day, he decided to get rid of some old things, clothes, objects, books he'd given her, perfumes that carried memories. It wasn't a therapeutic process, it was necessary. He couldn't bear to live with the shadows of what he'd had. He wanted, even without knowing how, to begin allowing himself to exist outside of that pain. Not because he thought he deserved peace, but because he understood that life demanded this, movement. And to remain still was to slowly sink into a well I already knew all too well. One afternoon, while out for a walk in the neighboring neighborhood, she sat on a park bench to observe the people around her. She felt strange among them, as if she had become invisible to the world. Until a child approached, tripping over her own feet, and fell near her. She cried softly as her mother ran toward her. Laura, instinctively, knelt to help her, wiping the girl's tears with her sleeve. When her mother arrived, she thanked her with a restrained smile, and Laura responded with only a nod. But in that small gesture, something inside her stirred. It wasn't about heroism, nor about redemption. It was about presence. About still being able to care, to act, to be there for someone, even if only for a second. She felt, strangely, that there was still something within her that deserved to continue. A small glimmer of dignity that didn't depend on anyone's forgiveness or approval. It was simply human. A few days later, she received a message from Daniel's sister. She was direct, but not aggressive. She said she had read the anonymous text posted on the blog and knew it was from Laura. She recognized the writing, the emotion, the hidden truths. He said he hadn't expected a response, but that he felt respect upon reading it. It was a way of saying, "I see you," without needing extra words. Laura responded with a simple, "Thank you." And for the first time, she didn't cry when she was recognized for something she'd written. This was a brief but significant relief. Writing, which had previously been just an escape valve, was now a space for rebuilding. And this gave her breath. On a gray weekend, she decided to visit the bookstore she used to go to with Daniel years ago. She entered without expectations, simply out of nostalgia, perhaps to confront her own ghosts. She browsed the shelves slowly, running her fingers along the spines, remembering titles they'd read together, authors they'd discussed, stories they'd bought together. In a secluded corner, she found an old book of real love letters, correspondence exchanged by couples throughout history. She sat in an armchair and began to read. Among the worn pages, she found a letter written by a woman to the man she'd lost, which read, "What destroys me is not the absence of the other, it's the absence of who I was by his side." Laura closed the book slowly, her eyes watering, but not crying. That sentence summed up everything she felt. She was mourning herself. For the woman she was. For the woman she no longer was. That night, returning home, she opened a blank document on her computer and began writing a new letter. Not addressed to Daniel, but to you. She wanted to put on paper everything she'd never had the courage to admit without guilt. She wrote about the fear of being forgotten, about the neediness that made her confuse attention with love, about the vanity of feeling desired, about the arrogance of thinking she'd always have a second chance. She spared no expense. She also wrote about the man she lost, not as a victim, but as someone who, even wounded, chose not to carry the weight of hate. She concluded by saying that, of everything she'd experienced, the greatest lesson was understanding that love is a daily choice, not only to stay, but to respect the other person's place in your life. The following week, she attended a small literary event hosted by the blog where she had published her text. She was nervous and insecure, but she decided to go. There, she met other people who also wrote about loss, trauma, and new beginnings. She heard tough, vulnerable stories, all of them filled with some kind of hope. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't read her original text. She improvised. She spoke about the weight of a mistake, the silence of regret, the loneliness that sets in when you realize you can't go back. The audience fell silent. At the end, a woman approached and said she felt the story was real. Laura responded with a tired but honest smile. It was. And it still is. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life with balance. He had started traveling again on weekends, rediscovering small destinations with his new partner. They had been together for months, but with a lightness that required no rush. He felt at peace, and that was new. The pain no longer haunted his nights, and the nightmares had ceased. He learned to live with Laura's absence as one lives with a scar that no longer hurts but is still noticeable. On some lonely afternoons, he recalled fragments of moments, but without attachment. Her memory was archived, not erased. He guarded her like one guards an old photograph, with respect, but without longing. In an unexpected moment, while walking downtown, he spotted Laura across the street. She was alone, carrying a bag of books and a cup of coffee in her other hand. She didn't see him. He could have hidden, gone astray, but he chose to simply observe her for a few seconds. And in that brief moment, he felt something different. It wasn't sadness, nor anger. It was acceptance. The certainty that, although they had lost each other, they were both alive. And living. He continued on his way without waving, without making contact. And that was enough. Across the street, Laura felt an inexplicable shiver. She stopped for a second, as if something invisible had touched her. He looked around but saw nothing. She kept walking, her heart racing, as if a presence had passed her by unannounced. Maybe it had. And even without knowing it, she smiled. Because sometimes, the encounters that never happen are the ones that tell the most. She returned home that night with a new feeling. It wasn't joy. It was serenity. The realization that, although nothing could be changed, there was still much to build. Alone. But whole. She was beginning to understand that true love doesn't end, it just changes location. And that its absence also teaches us. That the deepest pains aren't those we scream about, but those that silence our certainties. And from these, we learn more. Because it is in the silence of regret that the soul's listening lies. And so it was, between unspoken words, chance glances, and a long road of new beginnings, that Laura and Daniel walked. Distant, but marked. Without hatred, without return. Simply carrying within themselves what life demands of those who have made the wrong choice, the courage to carry on with dignity even after everything. And now she finally knew how. Time, with its merciless precision, created new frames for the memories that once burned like open wounds. Years had passed since that last conversation in the park, and although the pain was no longer acute, it still existed like a discreet shadow, resting somewhere in Laura's soul, who had become a different woman. It was visible in her eyes, in the way she walked, in her measured words, and in the way she observed the world. She was no longer driven by impulses, no longer carried away by promises that came without substance, and most importantly, she had learned to live with her own mistakes without hiding from them. She continued writing, not as before, not with the overflowing anguish, but with a depth that only bitter experience can offer. Her texts found space in a small local newspaper, and little by little, her voice gained a loyal readership. She still wrote about love, but with an honest perspective, without embellishments or fantasies. I wrote to warn, to provoke reflection, so that perhaps, somewhere, someone would rethink a decision before hurting the one they trusted most. One night, while attending a larger literary event, she was invited to a lecture on the topic of transformative losses. She walked firmly onto the stage, microphone in hand, took a deep breath, and shared everything she had learned. She didn't mention names or specific situations, but she clearly described what it was like to love someone who gave themselves completely and then see herself as the one responsible for tearing that apart with her own hands. She spoke about the importance of understanding that love doesn't always survive pain, and that forgiveness doesn't mean returning it. The audience listened in silence, and at the end, she received a standing ovation. She felt in that moment that, even having lost something precious, she was giving new meaning to her own existence. But none of that, not the applause, not the clapping, erased what had been marked as her greatest failure. They merely reminded her that life sometimes allows us to retrace our steps, but never the same ones as before. Daniel, on the other hand, had cemented a new life that seemed to grow with firm roots. The relationship that had been just beginning had become companionship, complicity. The woman by his side loved him with a mature tranquility, unhurried and without absurd demands. They built a house outside the city center, where the noise of cars gave way to the sounds of nature, and there they found a home. He didn't talk about the past, not out of repression, but because he no longer needed to. It was like a well-cared-for scar, visible, but painless. He had started smiling more often again, rediscovered the pleasure of simple things, and, above all, regained his self-confidence. He no longer sought to prove anything to anyone. He had learned that being true to himself was the greatest act of dignity he could offer the world. One day, while shopping at a bookstore with his partner, he noticed a familiar cover from afar. It was Laura's new book of chronicles. He recognized the art, the title, the signature. He didn't comment. He simply picked up the copy, flipped through a few pages, and realized she was still writing with the same intensity. There was pain, yes, but now there was also awareness. He ran his fingers over a page where she said, "Love only sustains itself where there is presence." And presence isn't just the body, it's the daily choice to continue, even when it's easier to run away. He closed the book slowly and put it back on the shelf. He didn't buy it. He'd already read that story inside. Time kept them apart, as it should. But on some deep level, they were still connected by what they'd experienced. Not by desire, nor by hope of return, but by an invisible bond that true love leaves even after it ends. Because some experiences are foundational, they shape who we become, and what they experienced was precisely that, a foundation that, even shaken, served as the basis for everything that came after. They no longer sought each other out, they didn't meet again by chance, they didn't exchange messages. But in some silent way, they respected the story they had and the dignified closure they had built, even after so much chaos. It was one morning, during breakfast at home, that Daniel received an unexpected email. The sender was an anonymous reader, who talked about how Laura's writing had saved his marriage. The content was simple, but the final message said, "If she hadn't told her story with such courage, perhaps I wouldn't have understood in time the value of those who choose to stay." Daniel reread that sentence more than once. He smiled. And without responding, he simply closed his laptop and looked at the woman in front of him, who smiled at him, unaware. She asked what it was, and he simply said it was a work thing. Moving on, he learned, is also about protecting what you have now. Laura, for her part, was walking towards the end of a long internal journey. She understood, over the years, that you don't always reap what you sow, but that every choice has consequences, visible or not. She was alone, but at peace. She no longer sought relationships as an escape, no longer threw herself into empty promises. She had become someone who lived with presence and listening. And although she knew she would never be the same again, there was also the quiet pride of someone who hadn't allowed herself to be corrupted by pain. Late one rainy afternoon, sitting in an old coffee shop, she received a message from an editor at a major publishing house. They were interested in transforming her chronicles into a physical book, a collection tentatively titled Letters I Never Delivered. She accepted. I knew that book would be more than words, it would be the testimony of someone who experienced love, destroyed, survived, and learned. Their lives went in opposite directions, but both were legitimate. Daniel continued his journey alongside someone who arrived at the right time and knew how to stay. Laura built a space of authenticity, where pain served as a bridge, not a prison. Both became better, not because of the suffering, but because of the courage to face it. And in the end, what remains is the certainty that loving someone is a privilege, but keeping that love alive is a choice. And that choices have consequences. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Which part touched you most? Do you believe it's possible to start over after betrayal? And how do you view the characters' decisions? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other stories as impactful as this one. Your presence here is very important. And before closing, let's reflect on this story. Betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It erodes trust, admiration, security, and the story two people have written together with effort and truth. The pain of the breakup is much deeper than the moment of discovery. It echoes through the soul, the choices, and the future of everyone involved. Therefore, here on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. We believe in love built on loyalty, respect, and daily commitment. May this story serve as a warning, but also as a lesson. Because, in the end, no love can survive where the choice is absence. Until the next story.